Welcome, James, and thank you so much for participating in this series. Please feel free to begin.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you to everyone who is coming on tonight. I really appreciate it, the support from everyone. So I appreciate it. As Erica said, the topic of my talk is Those Beyond the Walls, an examination of Michilimackinac extramural settlement from 1750 to 1781. I'll be explaining those dates as we get into the talk. But again, just welcome everyone. So since 1959, the continuous archaeological excavations of Michilimackinac have revealed about 2/3 of the fort, and the fort is one of the major fort and trading centers within Michigan and the Great Lakes, serving as a conduit for everything coming down from the upper country into the Great Lakes, going out through Detroit and Montreal, Quebec, and finally all the way out into the Atlantic trade circle. Excavations from summer of 1970 to 1973 to explore the largest settlement outside the fort's walls and uncovered 3 large row houses. This is the only study that was ever done, apart from mine, and apart from a soil receptivity survey, which was conducted in 1980 through a partnership with the University of Georgia and the Mackinac State Historic Parks. This is important in my research because it shows just how large the settlement was. Unfortunately, they haven't been able to explore any more of these features which they found within that receptivity survey. My research focuses on ceramic assemblage of 3 external row houses that were uncovered during that 1970 to 1973 excavation. I'll explore what the external village may look like in terms of the following: socioeconomic status, so kind of the wealth status of the people who were living within the fort and outside the fort and trading at the fort, ethnic identity, who was related to whom, as well as individuals' backgrounds who were living outside the fort's walls. And a portion that I do want to keep exploring as I continue with this research is the seasonality, whether this was a seasonal settlement or whether people were actually part of the community year. So for everyone who does not know what the Straits of Mackinac is, it is the meeting point of Lakes Michigan and Lakes Huron. This is a map from 1717, which originally showed Fort Tobaud, which was settled in 1683 to 1701. It was the first settlement in the region. Very, very small little fort on the the southern coast of the Upper Peninsula. And it served as a trading center until the French government shut down the fur trade in 1701. When they decided that they were going to reopen the fur trade and refinance all the forts and trading posts within the upper country and the Great Lakes in 1715, the French established Fort Michilimackinac at the very tip of the lower peninsula. And that fort is what we're going to be focusing on today. However, that fort is then will eventually become Fort Mackinac, which forms on Mackinac Island, which is where the fort existed until it was finally decommissioned by the United States government in 1796. So you can see here, this is one of the early maps of Fort Michilimackinac, the fort on the mainland, which is the topic of this. Again, a lot of forts. So for those of you who don't know the area, I do apologize. This fort was created in 1715. It went under several different periods of regrowth and rebuilding. Why I like this map, which was made by Lotbiniere in 1749, is because if you look at each and every square, those are plots which are owned by individual families. Those families have their names scrawled on the map, so we actually know who people were in 1749 at that period of time living within the fort's walls. So we have a very good idea of who was living in the fort up to a certain point, how many families and domestic units were in the fort versus a very small French garrison, and more or less what they were doing, because with documentary research and a lot of background study by historians, as well as archaeologists and anthropologists and ethnographers in the region, we do know that they were traders, they were merchants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So then by 1765, we have a very different looking fort. That's for a number of different reasons. The first and foremost is that in 1761, the fort is surrendered to the British during the ends of the French and the Indian War. That fort continues to grow and expand as the region becomes much more populous and people keep moving into the region. The fur trade was a very, very lucrative business for everybody who was on the Great Lakes, the upper country, and in North America at that period in time. So a lot of people were getting into the fur trading business, be it they were traders, they were merchants, or a variety of other disciplines as well, blacksmithing, for example. And all of this is happening at Michilimackinac, which is the center of a major trade network for both Native Americans for thousands of years, as they have been developed in the region and seasonally hunting and living within the region up until the arrival of the Europeans. And the Europeans immediately knew how strategic this location was. It's at a very important religious and spiritual and commerce basis for the Native Americans, and the Europeans were quick to capitalize on that. So as the fort grows, you can see there's a number of changes. By 1765, you have the complete reshaping of the fort, expansions of lots, additions of additional homes within the fort. It was eventually stabilized, or not stabilized, excuse me, by, it was originally garrisoned by a larger British garrison, which stayed at the fort year-round. And as you can see with that yellow arrow, people are starting to build things outside the walls of the fort. These are all labeled as gardens and garden plots and barns. And that red circle kind of in the bottom left corner is where the village should be. You'll notice it's not on that 1765 map, but the moment that we go the final map of Michilimackinac by 1766 or 1769, somewhere in that area this map, which is undated, was drawn, you see there's a cluster of homes underneath that red arrow. And I apologize, it's very hard to see, but it is tiny. But we do know that the barns are to the south, and then there's another row of homes or square rectangles to the north right under that red arrow. And that's the point that we actually get our only look at what the external village would have looked like. We just know that there are people living outside the fort through documentary testimonials and through this map, as well as the archaeology that was eventually conducted. And then by 1781, Fort Michilimackinac is fully dismantled and moved over to nearby Mackinac Island. I like this image, and I like to show this image because it shows what a colonial settlement, true by 1820, but it still shows what a colonial settlement at that period would have looked like. You have a lot of Poteau and Terre style homes, Poteau and Terre being posting ground, or pretty much as cheap as you can build a house on the frontier out of wood. You then dig a trench, you put the poles upright, and you slack it together with chinking, which is a mixture of sand and clay, horsehair or reeds to kind of allow it to bind itself. And that then serves as the foundation and the shape of the home, which then is used pretty much throughout New France and the upper country ubiquitously until people begin to get more sawmills in the region to be able to cut wood or begin developing other types of materials to build their homes with. But again, I like this image because it does show exactly how these settlements were laid out. Everything is on the water. Well, yes, the sloops are in there. You do have all of these different homes facing the water, showing that kind of aspect of commerce that's going on within the region. Documentary sources are both sparse and many when you start to look into the history of Michilimackinac. An interesting amount is that it's listed as 100 homes by John Askin, who is a very wealthy trader in the region. He eventually forms his own farm, which he, or more likely his slaves and his employees, will manage throughout much of the 1770s. He lists this as about 100 homes in the suburbs, which are now building good and tolerable homes. So at least homes that are holding up season after season after season. After a major event within the region, Pontiac's Uprising, which began in 1766, the British, after losing Fort Michilimackinac, really were adamant about not having Native Americans within the fort for what they believed were safety purposes after the fort was taken by supporters of Pontiac. So in 1767, Benjamin Roberts, writing to Thomas Gage, discussed that the Indians grumble very much about being hindered free entrance to the fort, and they desired me to have my home built outside for trade. And I feel like, as I get into more of my research, that's a very important topic, that as the fort became more of a militarized and more of a secured location, traders, especially traders who had lived in the region for a long period of time, wanted to have that access to trade. They wanted to have the ability to trade. And so they looked more favorably on living outside the walls of the fort, where they could have less regulated access. Another key factor is the location and the discussion of moving St. Anne's Church. Fort Michilimackinac being a Catholic church, a French settlement, when it was first settled, was Catholic. And even after the British acquired the region, a lot of Catholic and French individuals who were still remaining in the region, who were still trading in the region, practiced their faith. And St. Anne's Church, which is still a major part of Mackinac Island nowadays, as it's been moved there by 1781, St. Anne's Church served as a kind of rally point for everyone who was French or Métis, Métis being anyone who was of a mixed descent between French and Native American heritage. They retained a lot of their Roman Catholic culture. So St. Anne's Church being inside the fort served as a regulation point, but the desire to move the fort or the church outside the fort is a hint that there's a large population growing outside the walls of Fort Michilimackinac who are Roman Catholic, and probably by that, French or Métis in descent. Additional, there's a lot of ordinances that start to pop up by 1779, the year that the fort, is actually demolished and moved over to Mackinac Island over a 2-year span. Ordered that chimneys in the village be swept once a week and kept in good repair. No fire shall be made without the chimneys and in the streets. For a lot of these wood settlements in the Great Lakes, fire is a really important and dangerous thing in large communities. It will spread, it destroys Detroit. So a fear of fire may hint that this is a substantial settlement. You have a lot of homes that are close by that are all made of wood. Somebody doesn't clean their chimneys, somebody doesn't pay attention or keep their home in good repair, the entire community could be at risk. So there is some hint in this this ordinance that maybe this is a large-scale settlement. Maybe a John Askin's discussion of 100 homes is actually, it might be an exaggeration, but it's getting to be more of a potential that there are a lot of buildings in a small space. It is also interesting that they mentioned their engages or domestic servants, slaves potentially, were living within the area as well, outside the walls of the fort. That's something that, again, and I'll get to it at the very end of the talk, I would like to explore in the future as the sort of enslaved population at Michilimackinac, less so slaves from Africa who have been imported by the slave trade, but Native American slaves who have been captured and kept in the service of these traders, both French and British, throughout the course of Michilimackinac history. I've talked a lot about and alluded to the 1970 to 1973 excavations, and they were conducted as part of the fort's ongoing archaeology program. The fort has been doing archaeology since 1959. Every single year they continue excavations, even through 2020. So real props to the team at Michilimackinac for continuing their excavations. And on top of their normal excavations, they also included 4 seasons of excavations outside the walls of the fort. They found 3 row houses and uncovered around 20,000 artifacts before water screening. Water screening is a practice that was started in the mid-'80s, which is used to find very, very tiny artifacts, which has now bumped the entire fort's assemblage to near 2 million. So still 20,000 artifacts within a quarter-inch screen is a large number of artifacts for a very, very small space. And I will show you just how small in a few moments. And again, what I focus on with ceramics, which I eventually scaled into a hierarchy of high, mid, and low status to more facilitate exactly the economic benefit of the economic standing of the individuals living outside the walls. Here's an aerial view of the region of Fort Michilimackinac, circa 2019. You can see you have the fort with its reconstructions. You have that box showing where the soil receptivity survey in the 1980s was. And the three areas labeled A, B, and C are rough locations and generalizations of where those row houses were found. The project was part of a mitigation project to preserve any information as the fort expanded its parking lot, visitor center. And so as a subsequent part of those may be buried underneath the concrete, other parts may still exist within the park. A little bit more of a narrow understanding of where those buildings are is here. Area A being purple, Area B being yellow, and Area C being in that red-orange, depending on how you view color. And then you can see a 1973 sketch map of the features of the site, listing out the three areas. Now, something that does need to be mentioned is that Area B, the middle segment, was very, very heavily disturbed, not just by the parking lot itself, but by a variety of modern disturbances that occurred within the park. As the park was being developed, it should be stated that the exact footings and foundations of each building in modern reconstruction are located on their original foundations. So as the park's archaeology has continued, the historic replicas are on top of historical spaces. That does not include other things such as bathrooms, a bear cage, a camp hall, camp spaces, because in the 1950s, this was actually part of a larger park that was used by the community as well as seasonal travelers to the region. So there were a lot of disturbances, especially in Area B. So some of my larger analysis was unable to come to any conclusion on Area B due to it being completely disturbed. Now, Area A and Area C were two perfect footprints of homes, both which were row houses. And I have one image of those, which was saved from the 1973 study. And you can see that you have a large home. And if you pay attention to the colors in the key, it is a little hard to see in that photo, so I apologize. Anything that is blue and kind of blobular is a stone associated with a fireplace. So you have a home with two fireplaces, one on the western wall and one on the southern wall. You also have some floorboards that are still standing, as well as some masonry in between, some chinking, as I explained earlier, in between, showing that it's a multi-room house, possibly for multifunction. And the multiple fireplaces can also be associated to maybe a workspace, or more than likely, as it's a row house, a secondary dwelling within the area. Now, this is a really good representation because not only does it show the size of the building, but it shows the orientation. And that orientation is pretty much up against the lake. And unfortunately, what you cannot see, but what was explained in his analysis of the parking lot survey, was that these homes were more or less in a grid system. That the individuals who were living outside the walls of the fort were creating roads, they were creating pathways between the homes, building them in pretty much of a structure resembling a European gridded community. So what I focused on were the ceramic styles within each area. I found 23 different varieties of ceramics, or I didn't, excuse me, Lyle Stone and his crew from 1970 to 1973 found 23 different varieties of ceramics, which I then grouped according to status of the time. This took a little bit of guesswork, as well as work from other publications through Michilimackinac, Mackinac State Historic Parks, including a work by Miller and Stone, where they go into a very deep dive for the ceramics of the parks, which if anyone is interested later, I can supply them information on that. But you can see that a lot of the ceramics that are high status are imported things: Chinese blue and white porcelain, English creamware, French Rouen, Rhenish ware, which comes from a region in the border of Germany and France, polychrome. They're using different types of chemicals to create a colorful pattern. These are things that are much more expensive. I also included English creamware, which normally you would not think of as a very expensive style dish. It's pretty much just your general late 1700s utilitarian dish, although it's new. By the 1760s, the English had learned how to to create a glaze on ceramics, which they then call creamware due to its cream color. And that becomes a very ubiquitous type of ceramic, but it's very, very new. It's kind of like buying the newest type of home improvement gadget, Alexa unit, whatever you want for your kitchen to pretty much have on you. So I did group it as a higher status item. Mid status are things that are used ubiquitously throughout the mid 1700s. And then low status were things that I associated with food storage. Unglazed earthenware, very basic glazed earthenwares. And all of these were then used to sort of get a better understanding from the 653 sherds that I totally had for the project, exactly who was living where and what their economic status was. So here's a look at various different types of ceramics, including one of my favorite, which is scratch blue, and the various types of Delftware and porcelain that are coming in, being traded across the continent. And it is interesting to note that British-style ceramics account for 46% of the total count, while specifically French-style ceramics only account for 2.2% of the total. Now, that is derived from a variety of methods, including exactly specific styles of ceramics which are being shipped out from France versus the overwhelming amount of ceramics being shipped out from Britain. The English loved their ceramics, and they made a wide variety of styles, and they shipped those out nonstop to the colonies, and everybody very much enjoyed them. So finding French-style specific ones is a little bit more telling of ethnicity and cultural background and trade networks, because you're able to say, okay, this specifically comes from France, and it's a little less of a saturated market. The economic scaling, kind of lumping everything into high, mid, and low status, you can definitely see between the three areas that money really was not something these people were wanting for. They were traders. They were maybe using these ceramics themselves within their homes. And while Area A did produce the largest amount because it was the most excavated of the three areas, it did account for 64.9% of the total number of ceramics. You can see that the overwhelming of those 64.9% of ceramics from the entire area, just under 70% are high status. And again, the same for Area C, which is a smaller home, a little bit more, we'll get to that in a minute, but a little bit more modern of a home compared to Area A. It also is a very high percentage of high percentage ceramics. It is interesting to see how very few low status ceramics there were, and that's for two reasons. One, it may show that, you know, people aren't dining on low status things, that they're dining on their high status kind of status pieces to maybe show other traders, look at how well I'm doing, I have the access to buy Chinese porcelain, et cetera, et cetera. Or it may show that they're not storing food. And if they're not storing food, what are they doing during the winter? Well, then they're probably not living there. And as much as I really want to associate the fact that there are people living outside the walls of the fort during the winter, that this is a vibrant community, the ceramics do begin, at least for these three homes, to maybe suggest that people are only living there seasonally. They're not prepping food, they're not prepping meat, they're not prepping pickles. They're only there to trade, make their money, and then they're moving on. So again, the three structures revealed an overwhelming inclination towards high status goods. Imported ceramics were among the most common styles, including a wide variety and a high percentage of Chinese porcelain. In his initial analysis, Lyle Stone only wrote a 13-page blurb, the most of which focused on the architecture of the three homes for encouraging the reconstruction and interpretation of the external village. He briefly ascribed dates, and he ascribed Area A to being built in the rough 1760s and occupied through the 1770s. Perhaps a transitional ownership between French and British hands, or as more British things came into the region and people became much more accustomed to British goods, they're just buying them in general, they're just using them, and they're bringing them home. Again, Area B was too disturbed. It was highly disturbed, but it does show a very similar trend with Area A. You have rough 1760s through high 1770s, given the amount of creamer that was found in the building, which does show that people were most likely living in that period or that building during the period of the 1770s. And it is likely, given the ceramics that are found, very few French ceramics were found in that home, that they are British, or at least of the British period. Area C mostly had British-style goods, British-style ceramics, so it was likely built by the 1770s and occupied through 1781. Part of what my thesis also focused on, but not to a heavy extent, was the presence of personal adornment, which became a challenge to date in certain areas. But the presence of King's 8th Buttons, which was a regiment that was stationed at Fort Michilimackinac from 1779 to 1781 and demolished and moved the fort over to Mackinac Island, does suggest that they were destroying and moving and relocating the homes over to the island as well, as those buttons were found in the assemblage. Could also show that the British soldiers were gambling out there. We do have historical accounts that they were horse racing. And who knows what else was going on outside in a frontier village. But I think we've all seen enough Westerns to kind of know that there's a lot of business and business opportunities happening in a settlement town on the frontier. So there's a lot of options for people living and occupying and moving through this space through the 1760s into the 1770s, and at the very end of the relocation of Fort Michilimackinac into 1781. I like to include this view as well, which is Fort St. Joseph, not Fort St. Joseph in Niles, Michigan, but Fort St. Joseph at the head of Lake Huron, just to make things a little bit more complicated with the naming of the forts in the period. But again, you can kind of see how these multi-ethnic communities are formed. You have native traders coming in, pulling their canoes up, putting them up on the shore, presumably trading, interacting, working with the colonial settlers and the colonial traders. And the village, if you squint, looks roughly grid-shaped, but it's also kind of slapped together as more people are coming into the region, just showing that the growth throughout the period of the 1770s is exponential. More people are coming in and more people are settling into this fur trade, which is such a massive engine for economics for both North America and the Atlantic, including Europe. So where did everybody go? In 1781, Fort Michilimackinac is completely destroyed, relocated over to Mackinac Island, where it becomes eventually Fort Mackinac, because the British like to shorten things. And as you can see from this 1790 plan, you have a village of considerable size that is established within the Haldeman Bay, which is now downtown Mackinac Island, and pretty much streets that, if you've ever been to Mackinac, still exist, including that long line running more or less north and south, which is Market Street, which still exists to this day. This shows two different things. One, it shows an increase in population and a considerable development of the region, as by 1790, people are moving into the area. It's the place, it's happening. But also, where did everybody come from? I mean, you have the American Revolution going on during this period of time, which is, since it's very hard to move during a war, and I am highly skeptical that everybody is just moving in during the end of the American Revolution. So a lot of these homes, you have to wonder if they were instead coming from outside the fort, if it was a large-scale community. And as more people start to stay, not seasonally, but annually, and put down permanent roots within this community, is this where they're coming from? The other thing is that by this period in time, Fort St. Joseph has been completely decommissioned, and you have people who are living there in Fort St. Joseph. Where do they go? Do they go back home to Detroit? Do they go to Montreal? Or do they go to Mackinac? Do they join this community at Fort Michilimackinac on the mainland, and when that gets destroyed, do they then move, do you move 5 miles across the lake, or do you move all the way back to Montreal and Detroit? I'm sure some people did, but is it not likely that some people may have stayed within the community that has established itself within the Straits of Mackinac? So future research, my thesis focused on the economic and the socioeconomic status and the ethnic identity of a few homes. I have to wonder what else can be done, and I feel like a lot can be done. Only 60% of Fort Michilimackinac itself has been reconstructed, and that focus has been completing the interior as to the 1770s. They have done an amazing job, and they continue to do an amazing job with the archaeology within the fort and the historical interpretation within the fort. But again, that's only within the fort. There is so much more outside the walls of the fort that can eventually be focused on. So homes and excavations that focus on the homes of the 1980 Soil Resuscitivity Survey would be interesting. Are those anomalies just pockets of water or modern trash burials that were placed in the 1940s? Or is it additional homes? Do you have 8 or 9 additional homes within the walls of the fort that can be explored? And what would those look like? Would those show a similar trend to high status ceramics? Would that show that you actually have permanent settlements, that you have food storage happening, that you have food production, that you have tanning, that you have activities that may show more of a long-term investment for the community here in these areas? And again, how far does it go? What is the eastern western extent of the boundary? Does the community go all the way to the walls of the fort, or does it stop short? What's the space in between, and why? Given that it's a military installation, you would assume that they would want a little bit of a boundary between everyone living outside the walls and everybody living inside the walls. But where exactly does that boundary stop, and how many more homes are outside that resuscitivity survey area? Also, architecture. What do the homes look like? We have that one map of Area A, and that's it. We know that there are 2 fireplaces. Does that mean there are 2 different families? That there's a workshop and a family home? And there are 19,000 artifacts still to be analyzed. I did roughly 1,000. So there are faunal analysis, there's craft analysis, there's architectural. There is a lot more with the domestic artifacts that could be done to really understand what's happening outside the walls of the fort and what this community looks like. A demographic cross study would be, in my mind, very interesting. Erica Hartley and I have talked about this a lot, as well as Dr. Nastini, that maybe everybody is coming up from Fort St. Joseph, that you have this influx of other connected homes and connected individuals who all are part of this larger community across the Great Lakes. And exactly what does that look like? Do people stay? Do people leave? Looking at the names of the original settlers of Mackinac Island, are these the same names that we see in the trading records within Michilimackinac during the 1770s? Again, this was only a master's thesis, so I could only do so much. And even that itself at points proved to be a challenge. So, I mean, there's a lot more research, both research that I would like to personally conduct and research that I hope others conduct in the future as to what the fort looks like in this other aspect that we don't always talk about as much, or don't have the ability yet to talk about as much. So I'd like to acknowledge a certain amount of people, especially Dr. Nastini and Dr. Lynn Evans, and Dr. Jose Branda, who was part of my thesis committee for the creation of this project, Mackinac Historic Parks, William Clements Library, Western Michigan University, Fort St. Joseph Archaeological Project, and the Niles District Library. Thank you to everyone who has allowed me to study this, and I hope to be able to continue to study this in certain areas and further expand some stuff and some research. Again, selected works, but I am happy to answer any questions, and I'm also happy to anyone who wants to read it. I believe Erica shared my thesis, so if anyone wants to read it, God bless you. But I appreciate you, and you can learn a lot more that I could only, really give in about 15 to 20 minutes. So.
All right, thank you, James. That was great. That was a really nice talk. I did share your thesis on our Fort St. Joseph newsletter. You can also get to it through the Facebook page. There's a link to the newsletter that has that. But if you do have any issues accessing his thesis and getting the link, you can either shoot an email out to fsjarchaeology@gmail. That's our project email that I answer, or I'm sure that we can get Jane's email and send out if you have any direct questions after this. Okay, so then I have one question that has come through the chat already. But before we do that, I think that it might be easier if you just raise your hand. So I'm not sure how many people are familiar with that button on Zoom Talks, but down at the bottom, there's a reaction with a little smiley face. You can click on it and you can raise the hand. And then I can call on you to like answer the questions, or James can ask the next person. We can kind of moderate through there. But the first question that we have is, did the French leave the area after 1763, the end of the French-Indian War, or the 7 Years' War?
No, and I sort of blazed through that because there was a lot to cover in a short period of time. The French actually stayed, and that's very, very well documented in the historical and the archaeological record. A lot of the homes and a lot of the names from individuals who were living there on the lot beneath your map are big names during Pontiac's uprising and during trade in the later region. You do have a lot of people who continue to move in the region, and their families are big names, but we know that the French stayed in the region. I didn't mention it, but on the McGraw map from 1765, it actually shows, there are little legends that show who is renting from, not so much whom, but we can assume that the French had owned and retained property rights of the buildings that they built, and the British traders coming into the region, and actually at a certain point, up to a certain point, the British military were renting homes from the French. And at a certain point, the British military said, okay, we actually can't do this because there's a lot of issues with this, so we need to build a barracks. And the first formal barracks is built at Michilimackinac, but the French did stay, and the French stayed to the day. We have a lot of French names in the area, still to this day.
Okay, great. I have a question, James, actually. So I kind of wanted to know a little bit more about how you became interested in looking at the settlement outside of the fort. So what drew your interest there?
So I grew up on Mackinac Island. I was very lucky to have that. And probably, you know, they made a mistake, but my parents definitely dragged me around to nonstop archaeological sites and historical sites, and wonder why I'm doing archaeology now. Exposed at a very young age. So being able to kind of look at my own backyard in a very vague sense was important to me, and be able to kind of draw to that historical background, to know where some of the names came from, to know like the community that I am lucky enough to be a part of, what are its roots and what would I like to be its roots. And a good question I know that Dr. Nassini and I have talked about multiple times throughout the thesis was, is there actually a connection to Michilimackinac from Mackinac Island? And I think there is. I do. Arguing that sometimes I think comes to a certain level of what you choose to want just with documentary research, and just needing to do more documentary research that I couldn't focus on in my thesis, but maybe in the future I would like to look at.
All right, great. We have another question. Why did they move St. Anne's Church instead of building a new one? And were you baptized there?
I was baptized in St. Anne's. So a little bit more of the history to the area. They did not move St. Anne's Church, probably for multiple reasons. They didn't move St. Anne's Church originally when the fort was still on the mainland, because I think that was a way to regulate the French and kind of keep the French under control. Once you move it outside, who knows what those French are going to do, in the British garrison's mindset, especially that everything was so, things were tense in the colonial period. But once the British move over to Mackinac Island, the first thing they move is the fort, with the fort is the church. Because once you move the church, everyone's going to follow it. And the church moved multiple times. It actually had been established, I think the mission was 1770 on Mackinac Island. Then it gets moved over to Fort de Bod. Then it gets moved down to Fort Michilimackinac. Then it gets moved over to Mackinac Island, where it moves another time. So it's moved a lot, but it moves always with the people, and the people always move with the church. it's a very important aspect to European culture, especially French culture and Catholics, and they wanted to stay with it.
That's really interesting that you were baptized there. That's cool.
I know. I'm in the records with people from the 1700s, I suppose.
Yeah. Our next question is, do you know anything about settlements at French Farm Lake, about 2 or 3 miles to the southeast of Fort Michilimackinac?
I do.
I believe it's explored a bit by MSU in the early 70s. There's a book about it. So do you know?
So I didn't want to kind of go way too in depth in this talk. I sort of wanted a general overview, but one of the key points I looked at was Fort Michilimackinac external settlement and French Farm Lake. I wanted to look at what the ceramic assemblage looked like there, as well as what it looked like at the external homes outside the fort, because if it's similar, we can say, oh, you know, it's the same type of people, or it's wildly different. If you haven't read the book and you are interested, I do recommend that you purchase it. I know the park store, I think, has it in stock, so you should be able to purchase it. I think maybe online. I don't know how that works, but it is a very interesting study at what external farm looks like in the region, especially an area that doesn't have a lot of external settlements. And basically, everyone there is using creamware, which is interesting. And Donald Heldman, who was the previous curator of archaeology before Dr. Lynn Evans, was the one who came up with the idea that creamware was this high status good, that it was new and everyone wanted it, but then everybody at French Farm Lake is using creamware. That's one of two things. Maybe John Askin stocked it for his slaves and or employees. And so they had kind of like a stock home to go to and farm the fields. And then, you know, he had provided that, or more than likely they had traded for it and bought it on their own. But it is the 90% of the ceramics recovered at the fort at French Farm Lake were creamware, which is really interesting. So I hope that answers some of the question. Do you want me to call on people, or do you?
Yeah, if you notice, go ahead.
Okay, sure. I'll just go down the line. I see Jeff has a question.
Hello. Hey, great to see you. Fantastic talk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for putting your thesis online. I saw it this afternoon, and I got to just breeze through it. And yeah, it's really exciting. Great work, man. So my question is, how important do you think interpreting how significant is it to interpret that there's this whole other avenue of people that are living down the street from the fort? I mean, is it in your own mind, if there was, you know, no budgetary constraint, how would you foresee it being explained to the public that there's this entire other, you know, area outside of the fort that's also tied into the fur trade economy and to the fort's social and economic and political life?
Well, I mean, if I could have my way, and I hope that I know that I see some other park people in here as well, so I hope I don't step on any toes, but I would love to see it further studied, both for the archaeology aspect and also for the historical interpretation. I think you could do a lot with it. I know that a lot of places have tried and done various forms of interpretation without or before you can do like a full-scale restoration. And Lyle Stone's 13-page blurb basically says, okay, you know, here's everything I want. And he really just wants straight-up restoration, which would be great one day. But I think a really handy thing are kind of ghost frame buildings. And maybe, you know, if I could do it, I would put ghost frames up to just show that there are buildings out here and kind of give that sense of the community. Now, granted, the park has been there for a long time, and you have other things out there. You have bathrooms out there. You have, you know, some other history. You have a really nice native encampment where they do native interpretation. You know, I wouldn't want to see any of that go away, but I would like to see, you know, a few ghost buildings up. They do have a few placards. There's a placard by the restrooms outside by the visitor center that actually kind of shows a plot map and some photos from the excavation, so that's nice. And again, visitors are only going to see what visitors want to see. I think anyone who's done public archaeology knows that, or interpretation. You can only get across what the person themselves wants to see. But a ghost frame is always kind of a nice idea because it doesn't ruin what's underneath the ground, but it gives you that idea of like, there is a lot more here. And again, the park has a long time before they even finish inside the walls of the fort. So I'm not going to rush them because they're doing great archaeology. But yeah, it'd be great to see if I could. So I saw there was a question from Holly Swires, or Holly. She's in here, maybe not.
Sorry, James, I put that in Facebook. I was just
you did. Sorry, I just saw that first. So.
Sorry, I was thinking about row houses and thinking about sort of what is the history. I've looked at row houses later, so 19th century, and where they're much more clearly multi-person dwellings, and sort of thinking about what are sort of things that you would look for in the assemblage to identify whether that was more of a workshop plus a home versus a multi-unit dwelling.
Yeah, so the row house aspect itself, when trying to look at like individual homes, is difficult, because inside the fort we know that there are multiple row houses built because it's actually a cheaper form of building a home. You get a whole bunch of people together, families. You all kind of facilitate that creation of a structure, and then you're able to cordon it off as you see fit. And actually, Arca could probably speak a lot more maybe down the line to architecture and building formation. I just have a few things to go off of that I looked at for my thesis. But looking at domestic versus like craft, I think if I were to look at craft, I would look more at, are there crafting activities happening? Outside these buildings, are there smudge pits for tanning? Are there fish scale piles? Are people producing food? Are people doing different things within these homes? And then I think also looking around the hearths. Are you finding a lot of, because with the advent of water screening at Michilimackinac, you're getting the tiny little seeds, you're getting fish scales, you're getting all this stuff that normally in archaeology you wouldn't get. And Fort St. Joseph does a really good job of water screening and everything as well. And if an organization has the ability to do that, you gain so much information. So I think by not doing that in the 70s, granted they weren't doing it at that time, so I can't fault them for that. What else would they have found? What else would they have missed? So I think finding a lot more craft industries within these row houses, you could start to build the case of it's a workshop, it's a home, it's a seasonal home, it's a permanent home. We do know historically that most of the communities and the individuals living within Michilimackinac were living in row houses. So it's sort of the idea to go off of that they would be doing the same outside the walls, especially if the French moved during the period of British takeover and were renting out their homes, so they're making a profit, but they wouldn't live nearby. So I would assume that kind of a more in-depth analysis of maybe an undisturbed home would provide a better analysis of what's exactly going on. Craig, I see that you have a question.
Was that me, James?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, Craig Wilson. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So I guess in the course of your research, did you look at any comparative analysis for other civilian communities adjacent to primarily military posts? So I'm thinking like of the bottoms at Niagara, contemporaneous in the 1770s, same sort of situation. And if so, what did you find?
I didn't. And I think anyone who's done a master's thesis or a PhD thesis will look back and say, I should have done this. I should have done this. I looked mostly at Fort Michilimackinac and what was there, and I did comparisons inside and outside the fort. I only have access to a little bit of archaeology that was done inside Fort Niagara, so I don't actually have any idea of the bottoms or anything that was done out there. But I would assume, I don't want to assume, but I mean, especially with the fact that the French stayed in the region, and you have a lot of these communities that are so deeply tied both with native heritage and with families on both sides of the aisle and trade. I mean, people like money, especially everyone in the fur trade, that people are staying there. And I would assume that you would start to get similar ideas, and I would be very curious what something at like Niagara or, Fort St. Joseph, or looking at Detroit. I mean, Detroit's torn up, so good luck trying to find anything there. But what these other communities would look like. And I like that Michilimackinac has that sort of encapsulated 1970s preserved aspect of it. But you do have to wonder if it's a very similar trend, especially given the rise of the British in the region and the prominence of the French throughout. Sorry.
Okay, we have another question from Janie. And then we got a couple in the chat after this, so we'll take hers and then we'll go to the chat.
James, how far did the village extend to the east? Was it beyond the interpretive center and parking lot? Is there any evidence of that?
That is a good question. I know that in our talks as individuals, interpreters at Michilimackinac, I have heard everything all the way to the Shepler Dock. I have heard all sorts of different extents. There are accounts of people throughout modern-day Mackinac City, which now sits at the tip of the Lower Peninsula for anyone who doesn't know the region. There are accounts of people digging in their backyards and finding ceramics and nails and timbers. So I would assume John Askin's saying that there are 100 homes outside the walls of the fort. I think it's maybe 200 feet between the two areas. So those 100 homes are not going to fit between the walls of the fort and the excavation area. They're going to extend a lot further along, especially the fact that these are people who are trading on the water, and water is important. I would assume it would extend at least to the lighthouse and probably beyond. And I know that excavations at the lighthouse have found stuff, and they continue to find things throughout the area. Ceramics mostly are key, nails, and probably some other small artifacts. And then people are just there for a while. People are there, and people, once they develop Mackinac City, are there as well. So you get all this kind of build up on top of each other, which does become complicated, but there are anecdotal stories that people are finding stuff into modern day. I think people still turn things into the park and say, hey, I found this in my backyard, or I found this on the beach.
Yeah.
And the other question is, where are people throwing their garbage? And a really normal thing for people to do is just throw it in the river or the lake. And that's a big lake that's fast moving. So who knows what's washing up where, and then how that actually also will affect what's being found. So maybe going in from the lake a little bit and actually doing some archaeology away from the shoreline and deposit areas, which, maybe it's not as far as we thought it was, or maybe it is much farther.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Okay, James, in the chat, it says you mentioned two of three different kinds of artifacts that could be explored at the Mackinac Island Fort. Demographics was one, I think. Could you explain what those are?
So you can break demographics down into a lot, and the original study was socioeconomic status, ethnic identity, and then I wanted to look at permanent and seasonality. Demographics you could look at by ethnic identity, socioeconomic background. What are people's tax income, tax bracket, basically. Where do they fall on that ladder? And then I think you could also you could break demographics down into jobs and professions as well. And I think that's getting a little too nuanced at a certain point with colonial artifacts, just because so much of the same stuff is being used by the same people. That's actually a little bit of an issue interpreting native sites, as people start to use European goods, just because there are so many European goods being saturated into the market that everybody just starts using things. So you could even further look at it via profession or craft industries happening in the region.
All right, and then our next one is, are there any trade routes or trails left today that are visitable in Michigan, or was it conducted mainly by water?
Most of it was by water, especially during that period. You have a trade route down to Fort St. Joseph. I know they're trading in Green Bay and Wisconsin and going out kind of northwest across the lakes, up into the upper country, down to Detroit. A lot of people are using water because you don't have to clear woods or swamps in southern Michigan. It's very easy, and you just kind of canoe or later on sail up and down the lakes. Now there are paths, there are portages. Anyone living in Kalamazoo may know why Portage gets its name, because it's a portage between areas. And you also have a portage around Fort St. Joseph, down into the rivers to the south. And I believe there are discussions on trails leading to Detroit, Fort St. Joseph, and further down into that area, but I don't know when those start. And I do know that water travel is the more a preferred version of travel, especially on the Great Lakes.
Okay, so let's go to Dave maybe and then we'll go back to the chat. Dave.
Yeah, this is Dave. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, good. I'm just curious. I know that soil resistivity is a method that's probably still used, but it's very coarse, if that's the right word. I'm wondering if probably not you, but maybe Lynn Evans and people at the fort have ever thought about or plan on using any of the more precise techniques. I can't remember. I don't remember the acronyms or whatever, but you know, the radar techniques where you see it on TV all the time. They drag a device over an area and they get an underground map to help look for these sites. Is that something they're planning on?
Well, you can use a variety of different things. You can use soil resistivity, which is, especially if it's done through a university where it's funded, it becomes a lot more accessible. These are really, really good techniques, but they are very expensive. They're very expensive even for what I'm doing in like CRM, because I don't say nobody wants to pay for it. It's a very, very expensive technique when sometimes the maps at Michilimackinac, especially inside the fort, are so precise, scarily precise. A lot of the buildings at Michilimackinac have been located because of the maps. The one caveat to that is the first building they found, which was the barracks, which I should have pointed out was missing from every single map I put in. So nobody actually knew where the barracks was until the archaeology found it in 1959, 1960. So there is that caveat. The good thing with the Michilimackinac and where it stands in terms of soil, it's on top of sand. And that sand is really good for a lot of reasons because water drains through it. So anywhere that water is holding is going to be something that you want to look at. Is that a loamy deposit? Is it ash deposit? Is it wood that's rotted underneath? I mean, that sand is preserving textiles from Michilimackinac that they're excavating. So things have to be either really, really dry or well drained or really, really wet to preserve for archaeology. So Michel gets very, very lucky with its soil. So a soil resistivity survey that was even done in the 80s when, I mean, that's an emerging technology that's being perfected at the time. It's good. It's not as good as something like LiDAR, which is an aerial infrared scan of, maybe infrared, I might have butchered that, scan of the surrounding area, and that would be ideal. But again, I think it just kind of comes down to what's most feasible and when do they need to do it. Right now, the focus for archaeology, so my last year there was 2018, so I am 2 years removed from the current project. But the focus was to focus on the row houses, and then they had another one they were going to focus on as well. Hopefully, you know, who knows what interpretation takes down the way. So at the moment, I don't think so, but I think in the future it could be when it becomes more accessible and affordable, and when the park actually starts looking outside the walls, they could start to do something like that. But again, for right now, I think they have their hands full. So.
Yeah, okay, all right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Okay, the next one is, where were the ceramics at the fort imported from?
Good question. Everywhere. Well, not everywhere, but a lot of places. You get things, the big one, just showing how global the fur trade is and the colonial enterprise is, you get porcelain imported from China. Now that porcelain is getting sent to either trading ports in Europe, trading ports down in the Caribbean, trading ports on the East Coast, and then from there it's getting shipped in via the Great Lakes all the way up to Michilimackinac. And from there, it's probably going down to Fort St. Joseph, it's going out to Wisconsin, it's going out to Minnesota, it's getting shipped out into the frontier. So you have Chinese porcelain, which is a big one. You have things coming from the Rhine Valley, so Rhenish-ware, as I mentioned. You get things coming from Germany and France. You actually get a lot of Delft-ware coming from the Netherlands that's then bought by the English because they love Delft-ware and they start making their own Delft-ware. The English like to copy everyone when it comes to ceramics. And then they get really crazy in the later part of the 1700s and the early 1800s with like the styles they're making. There are like vegetable style ceramics that people are making, like lettuce bowls and like things that look like turnips and stuff. Really crazy ceramics. The British loved their ceramic styles. So they start copying things. So you get European porcelain. Until they learn how to actually create porcelain, they're kind of creating a knockoff cheap dollar store variety. The same with Delft, where they start making all this stuff. The French have faience. They have a lot of other styles that are coming in as well. So each area, and even true native cultures and cultures in Asia and Africa, everyone has their own unique styles of ceramic. One thing I didn't mention that would be interesting, I don't know how you could look at it unless you actually found one, is the fact that people are using wood. People are using wood dishes, wood bowls, and wood plates. That's not going to show up in the archaeological record. That's also a lot easier to move. And if you break it, it's not going to show up. So a lot of what we're finding are the sherds of the more permanent things, the ceramics that aren't going to degrade as much. And that's something that I'd like to look at a little bit more. And I think the interpretive staff at Michilimackinac would have a better idea of as what wood style things would be used, but I know they're using wood. It's easy and it's cheap. It's so light to compare it to a bunch of dishes to ship across from Montreal. So.
Okay. Is the second Fort St. Joseph mentioned in the presentation the one that is in St. Joseph Island in Canada?
That would be the right one, yes. At the head of the Huron, that Fort St. Joseph up north. I just really like that image, so I like to show it a lot because it does show kind of what a community looks like. And then, yes, there is the Fort St. Joseph down, which is tied to this project, where Dr. Nassini, Erica, and everyone works, which is down in Niles, Michigan. Just a little bit of naming issues, only got so many states to go off of. So
we'll take 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up for the night. So I have 2 in the chat that have been waiting. So did wet screening change the composition of the animal bone assemblage at the site?
A lot. So once they move to water screening, they start getting fish scales. And I just say that after 5 years of fish scales, which are fantastic for funnel analysis because you actually get to understand where people are cooking and preparing food. You get bird bones, passenger pigeon, you get turtle bones, you get all sorts of small little bones that you might not normally find because water screening is over a window mesh. So if you think about the window mesh that you have in your house, it's pretty much like that. You're spraying water over top, you're washing away the soil, and you're leaving behind everything that's left, which include larger rocks. But from there, you pick through and you pick out everything. And at Michilimackinac, they conduct 100% recovery, which means you're pulling out everything, which again is fantastic for for funnel analysis. And hopefully one day they can do funnel analysis of parking lot survey and other buildings. But you are pulling out every single little fish scale, and there are a lot. I mean, they're eating a ton of fish. But other animals as well. So once you switch over to water screening, you're getting that. You're getting trade beads. You're getting glass paste insets, fake jewels for cufflinks. You're getting all sorts of things, needles and straight pins, just how much domestic activities are happening in the homes, how much mending is happening in the homes. So it really improved the, I kind of put it as a par excellence for sites to be able to do that because you're really able to collect a ton of data. And again, Fort St. Joseph does it, Jamestown does it. If you want to know something, that's what you do, and you get a lot of good information.
Okay, so speaking of trade beads, are there any trade beads that were found in this outside settlement?
There were, and I originally, when I thought about doing domestic artifacts, looked at the amount of trade beads, and I said, I don't know how I'm going to make a good study or understanding of this because I'm not doing composition. I'm not looking at where they're made. It's too much. There were a lot found. There were a lot of different style trade beads. So when we think about trade beads, the most common one are like tiny little seed beads, which are very, very tiny. If you think about Native American beadwork, that's mostly what you're looking at. And those are found all over Michilimackinac. Even without water screening, you can be trawling through the soil and come across a red, blue, even white sometimes, and still be able to visually pick that out. So those were recovered. Water screening has since helped find those. But then you start to find other types of beads, including, and there were some found at the village, wampum, which is made from the quahog shells from the East Coast and that are then traded up through trade networks. So you are finding a ton of trade beads, including one of, I believe, 2. They're beautiful French style beads that are like about this big, about a quarter size, and they have a moon on one side and a palm tree on the back. I believe one is on display in the park and one is in their collection. One was found from the village, and there's just these really unique French style beads that people still are kind of wondering, what they're tied to, or who used them, why people make them, why are they the same style, but they're beautiful. So you're finding a bunch of different style beads, from large glass paste. Rosary beads are also common. Those are made of rosewood, which is a little bit more of dense wood, so it preserves better and it's polished down, or ivory or shell. And I should mention too that only one shell button has been found at Michilimackinac, and that is actually from the external village. And that's made from taking local. Growing up in the Great Lakes, though, I don't know how many, or especially around Mackinac, I don't remember ever finding clams. I know they found them down at Fort St. Joseph, so interconnectivity with different forts in different areas, but it's basically made by drilling into a shell and then pulling out the mother pearl-esque shell coating, polishing that down, and then they have the button. So only one was found, and that one is from, I believe, Area B, which is actually very interesting because they haven't been found anywhere else inside the fort.
Wow, that is really interesting. Well, thank you everyone for such a great discussion, and thank you again, James, for sticking around for the Q&A. We'd like to thank everyone who have attended, and we hope that you're able to attend the remaining lectures in the series. So next Thursday at 7 p.m., Jeff Now will present Dive into History at Home, French Colonial Blacksmith Shops in VR Museums. You really won't want to miss this. So I hope everyone has a great night, and again, thanks for showing up.